Okay, well, we'll start over. I want to thank everyone for attending this presentation this morning. And when I do these presentations, I like to start off with a story about how I got into medical education. I was with a student who was early into their rotation training, and we were in an emergency department and taking care of a patient who turned out to have a myocardial infarction. And the patient's signs and symptoms certainly did not look like a classical presentation of an MI. And the student asked me, well, how did I figure out what this patient's signs and symptoms were due to? So I gave him what I thought was the appropriate academic answer. I attempted to describe to the patient or the student how it was that, yeah, this patient didn't look like the classical MI, but he really didn't look like a pulmonary embolism, a pneumonia, pneumothorax, et cetera. And, but nonetheless, when everything was said and done, the patient still seemed to look more like an MI than anything else. And the student was very thankful, and I thought that I had responded to his question, but he had another question. He said, well, the thing that bothers me is that you did not do a complete history and physical, and you didn't do a traditional history and physical. You seem to go from certain historical findings to physical exam to other historical findings. And you didn't simply go from top to bottom and performing a usual history and physical examination. But it did seem that as you were gathering your signs and symptoms, that the response that the patient gave to you for a given historical piece of information led you to another question that didn't seem to be in an appropriate order, or you did a physical maneuver, you palpated his chest wall to see if there was any tenderness. And so it seemed as if you were using each piece of information one at a time as the basis for what you were going to ask next. And so my question is, what were you doing with each sign or symptom one at a time as you were gathering them? So I'm an assistant professor. I'm very full of myself. I'm happy to be in academics. And I opened my mouth and nothing came out. The student had basically asked me a question that revealed the truth about my medical decision-making, which was, yes, I was doing it, but I really wasn't sure about how it was that I was doing it. So I went home that night and I was really depressed. I was looking forward to this new career in emergency medicine. And I thought that, well, maybe I don't belong in emergency medicine, or at least the academic component of it. But I had some math skills and I had some computer programming skills, and I had an abundance of ignorance. I had no clue as to whether or not anyone was doing any work in an attempt to use computers to model how it was that physicians might be performing differential diagnosis. So I thought about what it was perhaps that I was doing, and long story made short, that was the beginning of my becoming what I believe to be more truly an academic practitioner. But more importantly, I began to appreciate that there were important distinctions between being a clinician and being an educator. And this student's question, my response with an open mouth but no words coming out, was basically the beginning of a new life for me, a career in medical decision-making and learning sciences theories that has been an extraordinarily rewarding experience for me. So what I'd like to do today is share just a little bit of how it is that the learning sciences is going to be playing an increasingly important role in helping academicians and clinicians to figure out how it is that we might do a better job at teaching to and assessing diagnostic capabilities. So we're going to start with our goals and objectives. The goal of, I think, really the learning sciences is to help medical educators optimize patient care outcomes by integrating what the learning sciences has to say, the theories, principles, and practices, into a model of mind, which could guide educators in the design of a learning environment that improves the diagnostic capabilities of tomorrow's healthcare providers. And in this very brief presentation, we're going to cover very superficially 3 objectives. Define the nature of the diagnostic task. And I think this is a really critical and terribly overlooked area in medical education, that we really don't have a clear sense of what the diagnostic task is. And we'll describe that in some detail. The second objective is to define the knowledge-based constructs and information processing mechanisms that appear to be most useful for developing this integrated model of medical diagnostic reasoning. And then third, to describe instructional and assessment practices that optimize the development of those knowledge-based constructs and information processing mechanisms theorized as driving medical diagnostic reasoning. So part 1, the nature of the diagnostic task. Many years ago, a group of individuals suggested that some problem-solving activities needed to be reframed or redefined as a classification task. And I won't get into all the reasons why, but simply stated, the objective of a classification-based problem-solving task is to identify the category of entities causing the problem at hand. For example, given this patient's set of signs and symptoms, what disease category does it represent? Classification tasks involve 2 broad types of categories, well-defined versus ill-defined categories. Well-defined or classically defined categories are constructs where category membership is predicated upon explicitly defined criteria, and all members of a given category have either 1 or more individually necessary features and/or some combination of features which collectively are sufficient to correctly categorize any instance. So as an example, here is a pair of pictures of a ruby-throated hummingbird, a male and a female, and there are these features that these birds would have in order to be recognized as, in fact, ruby-throated hummingbirds. Another pair of images is a black-chinned hummingbird. How to identify? It's the different description for the male and the female, but nonetheless, if you understood what these features were and you were in a field of hummingbirds, you could say, well, that one appears to be this type and this other one appears to be that type. And the reason that you can do that is because we have these working definitions that define what one hummingbird looks like versus another. Ill-defined categories, however, are quite different. Category membership is vague or fuzzy because membership criteria cannot be defined in terms of either individually necessary features and/or some combination of collectively sufficient features. So what happens when we don't have these criteria at the bedside that we could impart to a student to make it possible for him to always be diagnostically correct? Well, let's take a disease X, and let's say that disease X is characteristically associated with 10 signs or symptoms. So there is only one possible combination of all 10 signs and symptoms. However, a patient with only 9 of those 10 characteristic signs or symptoms can present via combinatorial math with 10 distinct combinations of those signs and symptoms. If they only have 8 of those characteristic signs and symptoms, there's 45 combinations, while 7 yields 120, 6 of 10 yields 210, and 5 of 10 yields 252. So collectively, the number of possible combinations that patients with disease X can present with given anywhere from 5 to 10 of these signs and symptoms, theoretically exceeds 600 unique case presentations. So again, student wants to know, well, what do I need to know so that I can diagnose this particular disease? And as a clinician, as an educator, the truth is, at the bedside, I'm not talking about the diagnostic technologies, but rather at the bedside, I am not able to give them criteria that they could rely on to be correct anytime a patient with this particular disease presents. And we, however, seem to give the impression to students that there are criteria, it's just that they are either not experienced enough or smart enough, like me, or trained appropriately to get it. And the truth is that most diseases in medicine or that afflict humans don't have at the bedside necessary and or sufficient combinations of features with which we can reliably say, Mr. Jones, this is the cause of your presentation today. So when there are no such criteria, we do know, however, that when we study individuals who are tasked to make these classification decisions, that it seems to be that their performance is a function of the instance's typicality. And more typical category instances are more likely to be correctly classified, where less typical instances are less likely. Now, how is a case's typicality determined? Well, that's been a large part of my research, and it's simply too much to talk about for today. So hopefully we'll have a chance sometime in the future to get into the notions of typicality. But in the meantime, there are these implications. The frequency and severity of diagnostic error, which arguably in America is the 4th leading cause of death. There was a time when death was caused by disease. But as we got into this notion of diagnostic error, some researchers have suggested that, well, cardiovascular has always been number 1 and cancer is number 2 and COVID never existed. So 2 years ago, diagnostic error would have been listed as number 3. With COVID, probably diagnostic error has dropped down a notch. But maybe the reason why we are not doing very good at the bedside is because we don't yet recognize or appreciate that most diseases are ill-defined. And yes, we rely on technology, but if you're at the bedside and you simply don't have a sense of this notion of ill-defined categorization and you want to rely on the technologies, the bottom line is you're going to commit a lot of errors. So what are the implications, further implications for medical education? Well, I strongly believe that differential diagnosis should no longer be assumed to represent a vaguely defined problem-solving activity, but rather explicitly stated to represent a classification task. And again, why? Well, if we can't provide learners with explicit bedside criteria by which they can correctly diagnose ill-defined diseases, then medical educators need to replace their current model of diagnostic reasoning with one that's predicated upon the many learning sciences, theories, principles, and practices attempting to describe how humans perform classification tasks involving ill-defined categories, or simply put, perform decision-making under uncertainty. Additional implications, okay, we can go into those, but the bottom line is we need to get into this notion of what is it that the learning sciences has to say to us. And to boil it all down, it seems to largely revolve around this notion of knowledge-based structures and information processing mechanisms. And we'll get very superficially into that shortly. Define the knowledge-based constructs and information processing most useful for developing an integrated model of medical diagnostic reasoning. We're now in part 2. Dual processing theory. It's a family of theories. It's not just one theory, but there's simply different slices or views or perspective of what this thing is in our head that seems to enable us to perform decision-making under uncertainty. We have reason to believe that there may be 2 interrelated but separate cognitive systems that enable us to perform categorization. And it's important to understand that each system has two distinct components. There's an information processing mechanism, and then there are knowledge structures that are organized to enable the system's information processing or reasoning mechanism to determine the category to which a new and unknown instant set of features belongs to or is a member. So this is the core of dual processing theory. There are two systems. Each system has two components. System one's information processing reasoning mechanism is rapid and reflexive, autonomous, and we have reason to believe it has something to do with pattern recognition or similarity-oriented approach to categorization. And the knowledge base that we believe is used by these pattern recognition mechanisms are stored previous examples of given diseases. And those are put into long-term memory, more specifically into what's called episodic memory. And when we have a new patient at the bedside, the theory says that you have a sense of what the patient's signs and symptoms are, and somehow automatically that constellation is then used to retrieve possible best matches. It's automatic, it's not under your control. You see something and somehow the back of your mind puts into working memory, oh, I think you have this disorder. I have a lot of difficulties with it. There are certainly individuals in medical education research that believe this is the primary mechanism that actually defines expertise. I won't get into that, but nonetheless, that's the system one mechanism and approach. And here's an example. So at the top, and I apologize, this came out to be pretty small, but we have 5 previously experienced exemplars, and their signs and symptoms. A black dot means they're present, a white dot means the finding was not present. And they got stored into our memory. And now we have 3 new cases that are presenting to us. And that's at the bottom of the screen, cases 1, 2, and 3. So I'm going to ask you to take a look at simply case number 1 on the bottom of the bottom 3 that's towards the left-hand side. And looking at that, and based upon your knowledge of these 5 previously experienced exemplars, which of those 5 does case number 1 best look like? And similarly, case number 2 and case number 3. And you have to study it a little bit, but I think that you'll get a pretty good idea that, well, maybe case number 1 is actually similar to exemplar E. And maybe case number 2 is similar to case D, and case number 3 is closest to, well, whatever. I won't say, I'll simply let you live in that question. But nonetheless, you have prior exemplars, they're stored in long-term memory. You get a new case, it has a constellation of signs and symptoms. Somehow it goes into long memory. Long-term memory tends to do some type of match or similarity estimate, and out of your mouth comes the diagnosis. That's system 1. System 2 is where most of my research has been in, and it's quite a different process. It's slower, it's conscious, deliberate, and it's an analytically based approach to categorization. And my research has suggested that perhaps the knowledge base that enables the formation of system 2 knowledge structures are what you would refer to as conditional probability estimates or disease by feature sensitivity estimates. And as we accumulate experience, if we have 10 cases of disease X, we certainly had the opportunity to store each one of those into long-term memory. But there's probably what we call an abstraction process that you can develop where you can develop a gist of what this disease looks like. This disease, 70% of the time they have sign or symptom A, and 50% they have sign or symptom B, and 10% they have sign or symptom C, and so on. So you get this gestalt or an abstraction based on your experience of what the more frequent or less frequent signs and symptoms are likely to be when a patient with this presentation comes up, so that when another patient presentation comes along, you have a sense of how to begin to weigh the relative importance of those particular findings. So here's a summary. This is a cognitive sciences-based summary, okay? 97% of patients that I've seen over the years are going to be over 40. 50% roughly are male, none of them have a fever, 35% have diaphoresis, et cetera. And similarly for angina, thoracic aortic aneurysm, pericarditis, upper GI, these are the gestalt, the abstraction, my sense of the likelihood that a patient with any of these diseases is going to have any of these particular signs or symptoms. But that's a more traditional cognitive sciences perspective. Now we're going to give you a sense of what this might look like from a neurocognitive sciences perspective. This transformation of weights or gestalt of frequencies into neural weights. So let's take over 40. Over 40 has 5 lines radiating from it to these 5 diseases. And notice that and I'll use my pointer here, that this is a thick line, a thick line, a thick line, and then there's a thin line and a thick line. Well, let's go to those frequency estimates. And you could see how the thicker lines represent fairly high numbers, those first 3, 97, 97, 97. Pericarditis is 25, so it's a thinner line. And then upper GI is a line that's thickness is somewhat between the two. So what the thickness of the line represents is the associated weight that is generated as we gain experience and summarize our experiences into changes in our neural network. Go down to hypertension, and you see that there are 4 fairly thin lines radiating from it and 1 thick one that goes towards a thoracic aortic aneurysm. And when we go look at hypertension, we see a 10, 10, a 50, and a 5 and a 5. So again, the thickness of the line represents the frequency with which, or the degree of association that our minds have established that exists between a particular sign or symptom and the diseases that they are associated with. So part 3. What are instructional and assessment practices that could optimize the development of these knowledge-based constructs and information processing mechanisms that are theorized as driving medical diagnostic reasoning? And I decided that rather than giving you my opinion, I would ask you to live in the following questions. Given a better sense of the knowledge-based structures associated with System 1 and System 2, what types of instructional and assessment activities might lead to improvements in the diagnostic capabilities of tomorrow's healthcare providers? Let's talk about instructional approaches. What types of instructional activities would likely support the development of more robust, fault-tolerant System 1 and System 2 disease category constructs? And from an assessment perspective, given that DDX appears to be a classification task largely involving ill-defined disease categories, and that an individual's diagnostic accuracy is likely to be a function of the test cases encountered, how would one approach the design of testing procedures likely to produce reliable and valid assessments of the System 1 and System 2 disease constructs of tomorrow's healthcare providers? So I'm going to stop talking. And hopefully there'll be a few individuals willing to say what they think about this.